Son, I keep hoping that if I make you follow the codes long enough, you will see, as I have, their importance. Hopefully you will not need as dramatic an example of it as I did. Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth. Welcome, everyone. I'm Liz, and I'll be our Ardent today as we discuss Chapter 15 of The Way of Kings.
I'm Elle, and I'll be today's Worldsinger.
I'm Adam, and I'm today's Veristitalian.
So, for today's world singing, I'm going to tell you about seatbelts. And it's not this particular story about seatbelts. In the course of thinking about the theme, I ended up reading the Wikipedia article on seatbelts and the Wikipedia article on seatbelt legislation. And they're short. I just thought they were fascinating. And I wanted to share some of the stuff I learned with you. So the world singing today. I know it's unusual, but we're doing. So before I specifically talk about like seatbelts and cars, I learned a couple of really fascinating things. Namely that the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has endorsed seatbelts on school buses since 2016. So like the last 5 years, they've been saying, hey, it would be a good idea to have seatbelts on school buses.
Correction, 2016 is not 5 years ago.
It's fine. It's fine.
It feels like it.
However, only 6 states currently require seatbelts on school buses. In terms of coach buses or over-the-road buses, Australia has required them since 1994, which is as old as I am. Fun fact for everybody, I guess. In the EU since 2006, and actually in the US on buses since 2016. I don't frequently ride buses that are not public transit buses. Public transit, I believe, do not need to have seatbelts, but a coach bus or something like that would. Trains, however, I was shocked to learn are not recommended to have seatbelts. The benefits of seatbelts outweigh the risks of being belted during an accident in trains, so generally we don't have them. So those are the first fun facts. But in cars specifically, seatbelts save so many lives. The CDC in 2015 stated that seatbelts reduced serious crash-related injuries and deaths by about half. The Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimated that the death risks for a driver wearing your standard seatbelt are reduced by 48%, and the same study indicated that in 2007, an estimated 15,147 lives were saved by seatbelts in the U.S. And if seatbelt use were increased to 100%, because it's not, an additional 5,024 lives would have been saved. Which is so incredible that this thing that is just 2 scraps of polyester and nylon is complicated, and there's a whole section in seatbelts about why it's what. These 2 little things and some metal and some plastic save lives so much. And what's also incredible is one of the common arguments against seatbelt legislation is saying that seatbelt usage promotes reckless driving, because the argument is that you think you're more safe because you're belted, so you'll drive more recklessly. But numerous studies have not shown any effect that if you're belted, you're not necessarily driving more recklessly. And that in order to increase seatbelt usage, it actually is beneficial to have legislation, and specifically primary offense legislation, as in you could be pulled over for not wearing your seatbelt, increases usage of seatbelts and thus saves more lives. Anyway, seatbelts are great. You should wear them. If you're not wearing them, please very much consider wearing them. It is very much worth saving your life, potentially the lives of the passengers in your car. Just wear seatbelts, y'all. They're really great. That's my world singer for today.
I have a personal story related to this, which is very quick. My third son is our contrarian, And our other kids adapted really well after they were out of car seats to just like automatically putting their seatbelt on. And he honestly never would. And it was like every time about 3 minutes down the road, we'd be like, why are you not wearing your seatbelt? Put your seatbelt on. And he didn't start wearing his seatbelt until we implemented a fine. Every time we left the driveway without him wearing his seatbelt, he was charged $5. And we only charged that fine twice. And then he started automatically wearing his seatbelt. So, yes, fines work.
So you're saying that restraints are good?
Not unequivocally, but in this particular case, yes.
But you're also saying that restraints are not unequivocally bad. That's a good thing.
Yes.
I think this episode, my brain's going to go all over the place. So we'll see what comes out of my mouth. But what I was trying to get across there is that in saying, like, people usually view restraints as bad things, but you're saying they're actually good things in various places is where my brain was going. But dear listener, it's almost midnight where I'm at. So my brain is, in some of these episodes, going to be out the window. But that means we need to move on to the Storm's Eye view. And that means that, to your listeners, you're going to get a really weird Adam this episode. But Storm's Eye view. So, mystery is afoot on the shattered plains. A strap has been broken. By whom, we know not. Maybe one of Dalinar's men? Who knows? A gem heart has been gained, and a fatherless king is scared. But he's not witless. Adolin learns of Sadeas and Dalinar's statecraft in the background with Falma. Elhokar warns of assassins, and Dalinar thinks he's overreacting, the poor child. And finally, at the end of the chapter, Dalinar reflects on his many story times with good old Noadon.
Excellent. Excellent. I love it. This chapter is a grab bag, so kudos to summarizing everything that's going on here.
That was not summarizing everything. That was summarizing just like two things. But thank you for the kudos.
There's a lot going on, and it's kind of a mess. It's a reaction chapter. This is the sequel of the scene sequel, if that's a deep writing excuses cut for y'all. Okay, so our theme for this chapter, I had a really hard time coming up with one, and then I found Restraint, and I liked this one. And where I came up with it actually was at the end of this chapter, right before we go into the next chapter, we have the illustration of the Alethi Codes of War. And one of the, we think about some of these pretty often, right? Readiness for battle. Adolin's always complaining that he has to wear his uniform. And the, not drinking so that you're ready for battle. But the third one here is restraint. And it says the officer will refrain from needless duels, which we do think about that part of it. Arguments or squabbles, our new favorite word, with other officers in camp. Yes, to prevent injury to men who may be needed to command.
Squabble. So
this idea of like, we have to restrain ourselves in order that like we can all work together to command. So I thought it would be interesting to read this chapter through the medium of restraint and thinking about who shows restraint in this chapter, and is restraint a virtue or a vice in each of these situations? Is it a good thing to have restraint? Like, the whole end of this book could have been prevented if we just like stab Sadeas in the back now, right? Like, if Adolin challenges him to a duel and kills him, like we could do away with this, and we could do away with a lot of Rhythm of War too, or Words of Radiance too, right? So a little restraint could have changed things. A less restraint could have changed things a lot. So what do we think about restraint in this chapter? Who's showing restraint, and is it a good thing?
So one of the reasons that I actually brought up seatbelts is in my notes. I wrote down the codes are inherently about restraint. So like restraining yourself from wine, restraining yourself from slovenliness, restraining yourself from squabbling, and like asking like, why is restraint important during warfare? And then, thinking about like what we've talked about, or okay, what I've talked about the previous episodes of like violence begetting violence sort of thing of if you're restraining yourself. Anyways, but I was specifically thinking about Adolin. He was chafing against these restraints that Dalinar had put on him with the codes of war because he didn't understand them and he wasn't willing to understand them. And that is when I was thinking about seatbelts, was like some of the concern with like not wearing seatbelts is like you don't understand how important it is, or you don't understand necessarily like why wearing that thing would be important. But like a restraint is keeping you safe, keeping you protected, and keeping the people around you safe and protected as well. I tend to think of restraint as kind of a good thing. As a creative, I like restrictions. I find it a lot more invigorating when I'm given like a specific prompt, or like you need to do something to a specific form, which is why my summaries are all my created heraldics, because that forces me to be more creative in a way that's beneficial and helpful to me. So I think, Adam, yeah, I am more on the side of I think restraint is generally a good thing, rather than thinking of it as like holding me back from doing what I want. It forces me to think about ways to do things in, I don't know, maybe better ways.
Going off of your seatbelt analogy, Elle, one of the things that I remember, I think this comes from a Freakonomics podcast on seatbelts, but when seatbelts were first invented, car manufacturers did not want to use them because it implied that the car was dangerous, right? And obviously the Alethi codes of war are an allusion to, right, chivalric codes in medieval Europe, right? This idea that a knight needs to adhere to a code of honor. And I think part of the implication there is that like men who are trained in sword fighting and have armor and swords and extra time on their hands are inherently dangerous to society. And they need to be bound by restraints in order for the society to function well and to actually obey those restraints. Otherwise, we have problems. And then I was also thinking about the Code of Hammurabi, which gets a lot of flack for being, oh, an eye for an eye and makes the whole world blind. But actually, the Code of Hammurabi was designed as a limitation on the amount of vengeance you could take. You can only take as much vengeance as they give on you. You cannot kill their whole family because they killed your cow. You have to make it exactly proportional. So it is a method of restraint of violence, in the same way that the Alethi codes of war are saying, okay, if you're going to be at war, you need to be behaving in a proper way in order to make this functional for society.
I thought you were talking about like, oh, we need to go to war because all these men are violent, or have like these skills, which part of me made me think of that old urban legend that like if you have a black belt in a martial art, you're like considered a deadly weapon and have to like declare yourself or whatever because like you have certain skills, which is just very silly. But I was thinking specifically when Sadeas is threatening Adolin, or not, Sadeas calls Renarin useless, essentially, and Dalinar calls him out on it, and Sadeas walks it back a little bit, and Elokar is, like, trying to, like, settle them down, says, I guess we can be done with that, and then Sadeas says that it probably won't ever be done, at least until Dalinar relearns how to act as a man should. And so I am wondering if the implication, because of this whole thing that has just happened, is that Alethi manliness is about a lack of restraint. That in this society, while they have this codes of war, theoretically, the actual practical, like, gender expression is a lack of restraint.
I think that's really smart, because there's so much respect for the Blackthorn, that part of Dalinar that's like unrestrained. There's so much respect for him. even to the point where people thought he should be king, right? Instead of Gavilar, because he was unrestrained, because he did not care, because he was so open. And there is that cherishing, that lifting up of that. Of course, that would have led to the downfall of probably the entire nation and like that bloody war across all of Roshar. But it makes me think about this moment in this specific chapter, though, when Dalinar's talking to Vama and they're talking about the wood and the soulcasters, and Vama says dryly, he says, "I take your point, Dalinar. No need to keep bashing the rock into my face." And then Dalinar responds with, "I've never been known as a subtle man, Bright Lord, just an effective one." And that's what I was thinking a lot in this chapter, is the contrast of Dalinar as the restrained Blackthorn. Throughout most of the entire series, is he's always viewing himself as, I was the Blackthorn and now I am a restrained Blackthorn, and then I can let the Blackthorn out. And it's not until the end of this arc, right, where he finally like kind of overcomes that, and he doesn't release the Blackthorn to deal with Odium. He becomes something different, and that's what he has to become. But I'm curious here, thinking with this theme of restraint farther along in this, like in the chapter, right, I'm reading it as Dalinar's contained, Dalinar's restrained, but it's like, in restraining, are we doing something negative if we don't become something different after that, right? If we keep restraint, like, so like, I love this reading of restraint as a good thing, and I fully support it in many, many ways. But I'm also thinking, like, can restraint withhold us from becoming something better? Because we're saying I have to hold all of this inside and I can't just overcome it or work through it or become something different, which I don't think this chapter answers for us. So I think that might be going too far of our reading of it. But I think there's this tension with restraint, right? If that can help us see perhaps some of the more fraught parts of it.
I was thinking about my friend teaches the classes that are for women in the LDS church on a semi-regular basis. And she was teaching on a particular general conference talk that she had been assigned to speak on, and it was about being a peacemaker. And one of the things that she kind of kept circling back to and thinking about as she was sharing her thought process as she was preparing this lesson was, when do you speak up and not let yourself be a doormat? Or like, when is peacemaking not shutting up and not being restrained? And I think that's maybe tying to a little bit of what you're talking about, Adam, of if we're restraining ourselves so much, of holding back our thoughts, our opinions, or like what we know is right or what we want to do, does that keep us from doing better? And I think we see that with Dalinar being so restrained in how he, for example, handled Sadeas, as, no, we're going to keep treating him the way that he's behaving. We're not going to assume he could betray us. We're not going to assume that he wants to plot against us. Dalinar's restraint ends up, as Liz was saying, causing all of these problems in the rest of Way of Kings and Words of Radiance that did end up getting resolved when Adolin stabbed him. And it was kind of that lack of restraint that like fixed a bunch of their solutions. And so I think it's something that like you kind of have to like be aware of and acknowledge where like restraining can like be holding you back from things. And I think that's something that would be or can be really hard to do.
I do want to add a caveat of a warning with that reading of like restraining is good, because like someone died at the end of that, right? The unrestrained Adolin killed someone, which is not great, right? If the unrestrained version of you is murdering people, there was a lot happening on top of that, and I want to acknowledge all of that. But I also want to just mention here the tension of that reading, where it's like, if we had just killed that one person at this one time. Because like there's so many complex choices being made throughout the series, right? It's not just Sadeas. the Kholins make really bad choices too, and they see the world in a very specific way, just as Sadeas sees it in a very specific way. And so, like, seeing it as this solves all of our problems of unrestraining ourselves and killing Sadeas, I don't want to fall into that reading, and I just it makes me a little uncomfortable with that. Which, like, I also see why, but I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and like, I guess to be clear, like, I'm not saying, and therefore the unrestrained choice of killing Sadeas was the best decision. I think more like Dalinar was too restrained, and I think Adolin was too unrestrained. I think there maybe was a better middle ground. I don't know what it was. I am not living in this world, but I think that Dalinar was aware of the fact that his restraint was causing problems. That he admits to Adolin afterwards of, I should have listened to you and we should have made different decisions because you killing Sadeas was a bad decision, but me not being willing to listen to you about Sadeas was also a bad decision. So I agree. We do not condone murder on this podcast.
We've made that clear.
I also think, though, that Sadeas is being restrained when he sends them off to the plateau to die. When he comes back, right? He's restraining himself in different ways, but also revealing himself. So I think, like, that's the tension of this reading that I kind of would feel more comfortable pulling out, right? Is how Sadeas is also an actor who is restraining and who's being restrained and being unleashed in various different ways, just as Dalinar is as well. And it's like, if the Kholins had unleashed themselves, Sadeas would probably not be there, right? But Sadeas at the same time was trying to be restrained and giving the friend that he saw was declining a warrior's welcome, or a warrior's welcome into the halls above, right? He was trying to provide that for his friend, which is a very twisted kind thing to do. At the same time, right? Because he's still leading him into murder. But I think that's the kind of the nice part of the complexity of seeing restraint and reading not just this chapter, but a broader stretch from this chapter, right? Because I think this chapter is introducing us into the tension of what both of Sadeas and Dalinar restrained do. It's not healthy, right? The back and forth that they're doing, the little plays for power, the little fight back and forth, how they are keeping themselves restrained is not healthy for this kingdom. And that's what ultimately leads to this Adolin breaking those restraints and those chains in a moment of murder, right? Is them being restrained in these moments is not healthy. At least in I think in my reading of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The one person who's not being restrained in this chapter is Wit, again. Having a great time making some wonderful puns at Sadeas's expense. And he does, like, have some great foreshadowing for the end of the book, saying, if Sadeas should lose control of himself and finally kill me, perhaps you can be King's Wit in my stead. So, like, this hinting that, like, Sadeas is going to be the one to betray the detente of restraint between all of these characters. It's interesting. Wit is always there, foreshadowing.
Do we think that Wit's unrestrainedness, though, is because he's not dedicated to the space and time? Like, is there a relationship there of why he can be unrestrained and why the others have to be kind of very restrained and kept? Because Wit has a longer history and he's invested in Roshar, but he's invested in Roshar because he doesn't like odium. Not because he cares about Dalinar himself. I mean, I think he does still care about Dalinar, but, like, there's that tension there, right? Of what allows him to be unrestrained.
I think part of it is that restraint is a form of humility. It's saying that, like, I don't always trust my judgment, and so I'm going to place rules upon myself. And Wit has many virtues, but humility is not one of them. And because he has been alive for so long and knows so many things, I think that's part of what allows him to just say whatever he feels like, much of the time. Because although he is restrained in some cases because he doesn't share everything he knows with Yasna when he should, right? That's interesting.
There's a book series I got recommended recently that I was reading, and specifically I'm thinking about the third book in the series that just came out, It's called The Undercutting of Rosie and Adam, or Adam and Rosie, I can't remember. And the main character in the book is immortal, and she knows she's immortal because she has died and then come back to life multiple times. And she has been alive for many, many years, and it has made her much less restrained. She says things because she's like, nobody's going to remember this in 20 years. They're going to be dead in 20 years or 30 years or however many years. She does things because, like, that is part of her catchphrase is like, nobody's going to remember, so I will go ahead and do a thing because nobody will remember except for me, and I won't feel guilty about it. And so I think I'm kind of with you, Adam, on I feel like because Wit doesn't feel as tied, he doesn't have strong kinship bonds to Roshar, with very limited exceptions. He's kind of feels outside of time. I think he does have a sense of like, I can be insulting and cutting and funny to the extent I think I'm personally funny now because nobody is going to remember this in 30 years, or I can go to another world and nobody there will know what I said on Roshar. So I think like in this context, restraint is about consequences. You are more willing to be restrained or restrain yourself when there are consequences for being unrestrained.
I would like to move us into our sacred reading now, to talk about another man who's restrained. Our method today is reading parables because this chapter ends with a story within a story from our kind of sacred text within a sacred text, The Way of Kings by Noadon. And we get this parable about the man who is carrying a stone larger than his head on his back. So he's got this heavy weight that's perhaps restraining him from being able to do certain things. And I would like us to read this parable and think about how it's a response to this chapter and the questions about restraint in leadership. Specifically, Dalinar is questioning Sadis's use of the bridge crews, right? Which is what brings up this parable. So how is this story a response to Dalinar's question about Sadis's methods? So we're going to start out by reading the parable, just so we all have it fresh in our minds. And then we're going to try to connect it back to Dalinar's specific question about the justification for using the bridge crews, and in general, the restraint of leaders. So I'll read the first paragraph. Elle, you want to read the second? Adam, you can do the third. Okay. I once saw a spindly man carrying a stone larger than his head upon his back. He stumbled beneath the weight, shirtless under the sun, wearing only a loincloth. He tottered down a busy thoroughfare. People made way for him, not because they sympathized with him, but because they feared the momentum of his steps. You dare not impede one such as this.
Monarch is like this man, stumbling along, the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Many give way before him, but so few are willing to step in and help carry the stone. They do not wish to attach themselves to the work, lest they condemn themselves to a life full of extra burdens.
I left my carriage that day and took up the stone, lifting it for the man. I believe my guards were embarrassed. One can ignore a poor shirtless wretch doing such labor, but none ignore a king sharing the load. Perhaps we should switch places more often. If a king is seen to assume the burden of the poorest of men, perhaps there will be those who will help him with his own load, so invisible yet so daunting.
So the question Dalinar asks is how long would it be before he could no longer fill the bridge crews with the suitably expendable? Did any man, even a murderer, deserve such a fate? And I think the reason why the passage comes to Dalinar's head is because he feels like the answer is that no man deserves such a fate. that does like seem the implied answer that we shouldn't be expending these men because he thinks that a king or a leader should be equal or should be willing to do the things that are equal to him. Which does seem admirable to have inequality as a leader. Like, I think I would like my leaders to be willing to do, I don't know, like live off food stamps for a month kind of thing in terms of political leaders.
I'm thinking specifically about did any man, even a murderer, deserve such a fate? Especially with our discussion earlier today about Adolin's murder of Sadeas and how Dalinar kind of lets Adolin off. He says, oh, you can't be king of Kholinar, like you can no longer inherit because you just murdered someone. But there's a tension in there where Dalinar's like, I didn't even have the guts to get rid of this person who was literally the stumbling block before us saving this entire world, or potentially saving it, right? Because they don't really save Roshar from the big bad guy at the end, right? But I feel like that's one of the core things about Dalinar is he wasn't willing to take that entire burden onto him later on in the books, right? Later on in the book. Instead, his son took that upon him. And I think that thinking about that, especially because it's like he'd been listening to readings from the book more often than he'd represented to Adolin. There's like a close connection to Adolin in this thinking. And the connection later on is Adolin actually does become a murderer. He doesn't put him into the bridge crew, obviously. He doesn't do a lot, actually, to punish Adolin. But is that a sense of like, Dalinar wasn't willing to do everything that he could to get to this moment? And thinking more long-term with the books, right? That's Dalinar's failing in many ways, is he has things that he protects that he doesn't allow to go further and beyond because of that fear of he did that before with his wife, right? He went too far with the burning of the one city that I forget its name.
Rathalas.
Rathalas, yes.
I remembered that. I didn't even really look it up.
I do think this pulls out the hubris of Dalinar, is that he is not willing to do those things. He's not willing to do what this parable is telling him to do, right? He's not willing. He's the eye of the needle in the camel type of thing, right? He's not fully willing to step down from that throne and lift up the bridge. He's not willing to do that. And so his taking of that is, I'm not going to have a bridge crew. But the other side of that is there are bridge crews that are already there, and you're not willing to step in and stop them in that moment. And so I think that's the tension here with that parable, is that he is reading it as, I think, El, your reading of Dalinar's reading is correct. But at the same time, I think the fuller reading is Dalinar's not getting it entirely. It's that he should step down and go lift those bridges and help them carry them back. That he should run those bridges because bridges are being run under his authority and under his rule, right? But that's what I'm kind of pulling from it.
But I think it's interesting that this parable can be read in both ways, that the king should assume the burdens of the men below them, but also that there are very few people who are willing to admit how much burden is placed on the leaders. And it creates an interesting inversion of Dalinar's question. Does any man, even a murderer, deserve the fate of being the leader and having to make these terrible decisions? Because as we see in Wind and Truth, like a lot of them fail at these decisions, right? Yasna is confronted with the fact that she's not willing to sacrifice anything to save her kingdom. She's not willing to sacrifice her family. And Dalinar likewise has trouble with, should he make this decision to sacrifice for his kingdom, and instead sacrifices himself. But we're in a book called The Way of Kings, reading a book called The Way of Kings. I think it's worth pointing out that like being in a position to make these big decisions is in some ways warping of the soul. It's hard to be someone who can make those decisions, and almost no decision feels like the right decision because it will always negatively impact someone.
And I think that warping the soul comment really connects to a lot of the larger themes within the Cosmere, right? Not only how does authority and rulership and that power warp your soul, but also how does longevity warp the soul, and how does having that power for so long warp the soul. Is I think one of the broader Cosmere themes that come out across the books.
Yes, certainly we could apply this to the heralds, right? Talon has been holding this burden for so long, and no one is willing to step in and take it from him. Even the other heralds have been willing to leave him with it.
I'm thinking about I'm thinking about a couple of things, but one that I am thinking about specifically, this book I just recently read by T. Kingfisher. It's a version of Snow White called Hemlock and Silver. And in the beginning of the story, the main character goes to a temple to offer a prayer. And she said, I don't have trouble praying in the moment for a thing. Like if someone is dying in front of me, I know how to offer that kind of prayer. But I don't know how to offer the kind of prayer that is just generally asking for help. Because what if I pray? I don't want to pray for something too specific. Because if I do, what if they grant that prayer and it causes this cascade of other things? And she kind of concludes with, I suppose only a god or a saint could make those kinds of calculations. And kind of like her whole thought process here very much resonated with me because that's how I often feel about specific prayers. But thinking about the burden of decision making and how hard that is, Dalinar is making a lot of these decisions that also have religious implications. He is, for example, saying that the Almighty is dead at one point, or at least the Almighty is much more complicated than we believed. That has implications about religion that like Navani struggles with and reckons with in the books to some degree. And so when you're like eternal soul, whether because it's a Spren-like thing now or because, you're just a normal human who is no longer going to the Tranquiline Halls in the way you thought you were, I feel like that adds another dimension to a leadership that is additionally hard to reckon with. I think if he was like merely a political leader, it would be one thing that would be hard and difficult and not insignificant. But I think adding the religious and spiritual connotations of, is my soul going to find rest, essentially, just feels like it makes things harder.
Okay, we're going to move on to do the Wisdom of the Herald segment, which is where we talk about what we are going to bring from this reading back into our lives.
I'll go first. This isn't something we quite talked about, but it's something that I thought about while we were talking about restraint, and it's that I want to be a lot more open with the restraints that I place on myself with other people. I think in our pulling apart the different restraints that we saw in this chapter, we were being open with the characters and being like pulling those out and putting them up and, acknowledging what those restraints were and acknowledging what would happen if we removed those restraints. And I think that's really important to do in relationships with people around you, is like acknowledge you are restraining yourself in this way and because of X, Y, and Z, right? And seeing the longer history of that in your life and why you're acting in that way. And so I think for me, I want to be a little bit more open about what is restraining me, what's holding me back, but also why am I placing those restraints on myself? Why am I allowing those restraints to guide me in life? And then I think on top of that, to ask the question of like, do I need to have that restraint, or like, is the restraint helping me? Is the restraint holding me back? Or do I need to transform myself to get over needing the restraint? in different ways is something I'm going to try to think about going forward.
I think the thing that I have thought about is the ways in which restraints have been beneficial for me. I really like schedules. I just find it really hard to stick to them, which having ADHD is not really a surprise. But I really thrive when I have a schedule, and I want to try to find, at least for a day or a week, a schedule that works for me and helps me feel better about my life, because it gives me something to rely on and to like take comfort in, and remind me that, like, I don't know, I can do the things I want to do.
And I think the thing I'm going to think about is the burdens that other people bear around me, especially those who are in leadership positions, who may be handling more than I know. And having a greater appreciation for people who are bearing that burden on my behalf, of organizing things, of managing things, so that I can do my job in various aspects of my life. And just showing more appreciation and gratitude to those who are shouldering that invisible burden.
You also need to pay gratitude to yourself for shouldering that burden for others as well.
This is true.
Especially because you're an awesome mom.
I appreciate that. We have a box on my counter that is for nice notes for mom. It's so cute. My sister-in-law gave it to me. It's very fun.
Print that part out of the transcript and put it in for me.
Okay, will do.
Not that you're my mom, but as an added note.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.
And I'm Adam, and I'm today's Veristitalian. However you say that word.
There's just one
I'm
T. Talian. No, there's
Talian.
two. There's not three.
There's two T's.
There's just not
That's
three.
Okay. What if we want a third T as a treat? Just one. That's all I want. Just one T. Come on, Brandon. Just a little T. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam, and I am today's Veristitalian. No, how do you... God.
You got it right.